The first question, I have a really interesting question from Dr. Animesh Tandon, and he is asking, what do we think is the public equivalent cost of the advice that ShipMD could or would provide, such as regulatory advice, clinical trial setup, etc.? Could that be a value proposition that ShipMD could sell to venture capitalists or payers? If you are trying to speak, you're on mute, so please make sure to check that you're not on mute. Yes, Patrick, I think you were saying something.
Sure, I'll jump in and welcome my colleagues to follow on. I think this is it's a great question, and it points directly to the benefit of participating in ShipMD. I look at this from a small company perspective, working with a lot of startups in medical devices. I think there certainly is, I don't know about the exact public equivalent cost of the advice that ShipMD would provide, but there's certainly value in that. And, I don't know if we would sell it to the venture community or payers directly, but it would provide the innovators more, confidence that these, the services that would be provided would allow them more consistent and timely access to the market. And so I think that makes it, compelling for the investors. There's a whole regular reimbursement workstream as part of this initiative that would look to address some of the obstacles in payment. And I think that, that in itself provides inherent value for those innovators and the investors behind those companies. That assurance that there is, that the company has a reimbursement strategy and a pathway as they move towards commercialization. So I think it's a good question, and this is exactly what the value proposition is for those innovators.
We had touched on this yesterday during the discussion as well, and a couple points to add that, one of the tasks for the consortium will be to do an analysis of what the alternatives are out there for these various services, and define what a reasonable, cost structure is. Two of the key benefits and differentiators that we see or discussed yesterday would be, I guess to use the pithy term, one-stop shop for these services, and the benefits of small companies availing themselves of a single outlet for advice as opposed to cobbling together a series of advisors. There's that benefit, and our clinical colleagues also mentioned the real benefit of being able to quote unquote plug into the trial networks of these hospitals, which is a very difficult thing to do. And so I think we see the pricing as something that needs to be done on a competitive basis, but that there are some unique drivers of value through this construct that would be unique to SHIP itself. I'll just kind of pause there.
Thanks, Chris. I see that Animesh, the question that I just had directed to you, to the panelists, he has a follow-up clarification. So basically he's saying when he says sell, he means would that be a way to demonstrate the value proposition of ShipMD to the payers and venture capitalists so that they might support ShipMD financially? So basically, I think what he's saying is that all of the benefits of this ShipMD in terms of the various pieces of advice that ShipMD is going to present, could that be presented to the payers and financial entities so that, they come up with the money to support the entity?
I can take a stab at that one.
Yes, hi, Terry. Mm-hmm.
Hi. I think that's the hope of what ShipMD could offer, and certainly something that the consortium would work through what would be the value of the services, but having some of those options within a single point of contact for an innovator or a startup. We would hope that the startup would have better advice, stronger business plan, access to clinical experts to really refine a strategy for clinical trials, things like that I think would attract more venture capital, as an example, to those companies to fund them. And we've talked also about the notion that ChipMD could play a role in connecting those companies that participate with not only venture capital, but also perhaps foundations for grants. So the idea that this ecosystem could attract more investment capital for these companies is something that we're very hopeful would occur.
Thank you, Terry.
As another fellow investor there, I think it may be challenging at the outset to engage venture capital.
John, I think
funds funding into.
John,
am I breaking up?
I want to turn on your video because I think there's some sort of a bandwidth issue from your side. Maybe that'll help. Your voice is coming in a little choppy. Yeah.
Does that help?
I think yes. Hopefully, yeah.
Okay, let me try again. I think it's going to be a challenge to engage venture capital funds and other significant funders of medical devices from an investment point of view at that early consortium stage. I think at some point you may be able to get some engagement there, but investors are going to start to look for a track record. And what's really going to get them excited is when they see innovations start to come through the system and perform well and have success because they are part of this system. We are a track record focused community. And so at the outset, they may be a tough group to get into this as a financial supporter, which is why I lean a little bit more towards the foundation side and those kinds of groups who aren't looking for that return at the outset. So I suppose there are a couple of exceptions. There are some funds that have philanthropic activities, and I think they'd be a great target, but that's a pretty short list. So,
right. Thanks, John.
I think this is Pedro. One other comment I would make. I think it's important not to forget one of the major benefits of participating in CHIP, which is access to hospitals where you can conduct your clinical trials. The advice and strategy is important. It's important in how you're going to approach both the regulatory side and even the commercialization and reimbursement. But I would say one of the core values that CHIP brings is the ability to generate evidence, to generate data. And that's generated typically in the clinical setting, whether it's in hospital or outpatient. But that's, I think, the sweet spot for CHIP. It's not so much of to set up a consulting agency, but I think we'll have that expertise. But I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that its primary mission is really to generate the evidence, which is a huge value.
Thank you, Pedro. Anyone else in the panel have any thoughts? Vasum, perhaps you have any thoughts about this?
Thank you. Number one, Chris, Patrick, thank you once again for a fantastic presentation, really clarifying the parameters that we're dealing with here. And just to build a little bit on the conversation and then also on what Pedro just mentioned, for some clarity, on the front end, when we think about that, quote unquote, consulting service that we might be able to provide, we want to think about the entire system that we're developing in terms of what's the value add to the entire ecosystem. We're not looking to duplicate or, maybe, I think the simple word is just to duplicate services that are already available and that are available well. If there are things that we can provide that we can improve on, especially at the level when a sponsor or innovator is ready to engage the clinical evidence generation process, that is probably going to be the sweet point with respect to being qualified to engage the CHIP system, and also the right balance between a synergistic value for both CHIP and the innovator. So I think we just need to be practical in thinking about what is a scope of service and where does that begin. And I know Pedro and John Parker have been discussing this in the navigation workstream as well. So, but definitely all of these components, all of the work streams integrate into a single system that we're thinking about.
Thanks, Vasum. Any other thoughts about this particular question? If not, I'll jump on to one more question that this seems really relevant, even though I was sent this question by another work stream that is going on right now in parallel, but it is particularly relevant to the finance aspect of the things. A person from Actuated Medical, they're saying that every time a new hospital is added to a study that they're running, it's at least $100,000 for an admin and a research nurse alone, regardless of number of participants. Very hard to fund this. How will ShipMD account for these type of expenses that basically going to quickly add up when we start adding more hospitals?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, to collect their thoughts, definitely want to get the rest of the panel involved here. But very simply put, I think we have to recognize that in the system that we're creating, that is intended to work for the vast majority of innovation that can make a difference for children, this isn't going to be a case-by-case basis, meaning, we're not planning necessarily to add X or Y or Z or A or B hospital on a as ad hoc or as needed basis. The intent here is a qualified group of institutions, hospitals that have the breadth and depth of infrastructure, expertise, and experience to be able to create a safe innovation network and environment nationally to be able to conduct these trials. And we want there to be a synergistic process amongst all the different institutions and the innovators and the ShipMD system. So for all of that to occur and to occur in an optimal manner, we need to have a foundation of those qualified institutions. And the intent would be for those qualified institutions to have the quote unquote bandwidth or the breadth of patients and the, again, expertise, subspecialties, ICUs, everything that is necessary to be able to conduct these trials safely to already exist so that we can tap into them whenever an innovator or a company that comes to us needs those services or those specific patients. And just to add one more point to that, as one of the foundational tenets here, we always think about, I should say, the pediatric evidence generation process as being challenging for a number of reasons, but one in particular. That's the issue that, patients or populations in pediatrics for different conditions are rare, they're small populations, they're heterogeneous, they're geographically dispersed, whether it's across the country or across the world. Within the ShipMD system, one of the major benefits is the fact that we would be engaging the health systems and the hospitals that truly take care of those patients every day. These patients are not rare to those hospitals. So if we have that group of hospitals as part of the ShipMD system, that will be, or those places will be the institutions where these patients are taken care of, the physicians and the nurses, the perfusionists, and everybody else that takes care of those patients understands how to take care of them. They have the infrastructure and experience to be able to do it safely, especially when we're thinking about novel technology evaluations and novel technology development. So that's the type of environment that we're trying to create, and I hope that adds a little bit of clarity for folks in terms of understanding how this system might be very unique from other examples or models that may exist. This would really bring something that doesn't currently exist to the ecosystem.
Perfectly explained. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Building on that, I think it would bring operational efficiency, for that company, for a company like Actuated or others that are wanting to run trials at multiple sites and having these costs, it would potentially bring some efficiency to that process for them. So I think it's very, very helpful clarity.
Yeah, perfect, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone has more thought about this question? Okay, so there's one more question from Gary Dulac. And hi, Gary, good to see you again. And the question is, it seems like the goals and scope of the two entities, that is Consortium and ShipMD, still need to be more clearly delineated. This has been a confusion on my part. What I hear now is that the consortium is the ecosystem and ChipMD is the clinical core. Is that correct? Or can you, anyone in the panel, better clarify where exactly does the consortium end and where does the ChipMD start, and what are the differences between the two? Yes, Vasum.
I'll take a pass at it. I think it's a great question, and I think it actually gets that. It's a little bit more of a vernacular issue, and I appreciate the clarity that the questioner is requesting. So I would think about this more as an entire entity as itself, and ChipMD is this entire entity and this entire enterprise, just in a simple term. The distinction between perhaps what we're thinking about as the consortium, which I think maybe the questioner is thinking as the advisory group to the entire enterprise. That's also another distinct way of considering it. Within the ChipMD enterprise, there will be a network of qualified or quote unquote CHIP qualified hospitals, and that will be the evidence generation infrastructure for CHIP. But this is really a integrated enterprise in its entirety, and I wouldn't want to create overly distinct aspects. I think Chris and Patrick very well laid out the areas where there needs to be some level of distinction in terms of how the operational or the functional operations of certain aspects exist, meaning there might be a governing board that is advising the ChipMD nonprofit organization that is managing and helping to coordinate the ChipMD hospitals. And then at the final end, maybe down the line in terms of time, as Chris pointed out, there could be a potential time for an entity that helps to support cash-strapped companies. But that's down the line. That's not right now. And I think that was Chris's point D in that very nice graphic slide that we had. But I hope that adds a little bit of clarity. But I think it's an important vernacular point to begin to think through.
Yes, thanks, Vasum. Again, to Gary, please let us know if this clarifies. If you have any follow-up thoughts about what Vasum explained, we are happy to elaborate. But anyone else in the panel has any thoughts on this? John, if your video has improved, you can try turning on your video and hopefully it will work now. Okay, so yeah, Chris, Patrick, anyone else, any thoughts about the differences? Because I guess you made that graph, right? So yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I think it really was, as Vasum said, to just put a finer point on the distinct sort of operational aspects and funding sources that will be required as we move through these phases and moving towards that freestanding nonprofit entity of ChipMD.
I agree, and to be frank, it's hard to encapsulate the number of entities and stakeholders in the system on a single slide. And I think that's the best way we could sort to do it practically, where there will be an entity at the center here that has its own fiduciary duties to operate as a nonprofit organization, provide service, be responsible for funds that it accepts, and have contractual relationships with other entities across the system, which is why we had that as a single box. But Vasum is absolutely right. This is meant to operate at the center of a very large system and has mechanisms for interaction, with the different actors across the system, which is what we try to instill in that kind of above the line box there. So apologies for any confusion and graphic challenges.
No worries at all, Chris. It's a complicated concept, and I get it. It's difficult to demonstrate everything, all the moving parts that are there in one single slide. So yeah, no, it's perfectly valid question, and I'd like to thank Gary again for such a nice feedback here. And then there is another question from Beverly Tang. How do you plan to pressure test what fee structure makes sense for the innovators? Or do you have a goalpost for this fee yet? Or this is something that is still into the future? And how many innovators can your current operating model support at any given one time?
Well, I will kick off and welcome further thoughts from the panel and others on the EC. This is something that the finance stream looked at, but did not go into too much detail because these are some issues that need to be worked out in this next phase of strategic planning in terms of some of the specific, fee structures and the capacity to work with these innovators. We did do some research on just the sort of the market, if you will, the number of companies that are out there producing pediatric medical devices, the number of small company innovators that are there, and noted, of course, that many of them are small startups, spin outs from an academic or clinical setting. And I think we've had some other questions there about the financial needs and of these small companies, and maybe the challenges that they would face in coming into ShipMD. So it's something we did acknowledge. We looked at, so again, that sort of market, that universe of companies, put that in, we felt there's certainly more than 100, probably less than 300 or 400. It's tough to exactly put a figure on that, but, just getting a sense of the number of companies that are out there is helpful. I think in terms of, how many companies could come through the ecosystem at a given time, some of that is dependent on the number of hospitals and, how rapidly we are able to scale, ShipMD services. But, I think we have been certainly cognizant of the financial pressures and constraints that small companies face and the support that may be needed to help them participate effectively in this. And I think it's a great suggestion on, SBIR grants. That's certainly a potential. Again, we feel that the creation of ShipMD, the services that it would provide, this network of expertise, that system level that we've described, would really help to catalyze investment from many sources for small companies that are developing these products. Make it easier for them to secure that NIH SBIR funding. Make it easier for them to secure, private foundational grants to support some of these activities. Make it easier to bring in those minority equity investors of angel and venture and family offices. So, we've been cognizant of this and examining that, and I think that's something that, again, within the strategic planning process, would be defined and clarified.
Right. I think, yeah.
Just to echo that, I mean, that's why we felt it was pretty clear that SHIP would need to raise its own outside grant funding to support itself. Because if you think of SHIP's top line revenue in commercial terms, if you have 100 innovators coming through your system and they're able to afford $50,000 to choose a round number, that's a $5 million revenue line that you would need to operate this system level view on. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do. And so we feel it's important for SHIP itself to raise its own bedrock of funding support until you get to the point where economies of scale start to kick in. You got the track record, that John started speaking to earlier on, where you can get more volume through the system and charge fees that, will generate the right level of demand and outcomes and maybe allow SHIP to become sustainable. So I think it's a pathway that will be on here for the initiative.
Thanks, Chris.
Stop me if I'm not coming through clearly. I think that we've got a basis of costs out there in the system already. Companies have to pay to get the work done in trials, in getting support for all sorts of things as they proceed. ShipMD, the way I'm seeing it, is not trying to necessarily change the system. We're trying to streamline it, trying to set it up so that we can do this more efficiently, and through scale, lower costs, get things done better, avoid mistakes, all of this. So I think those metrics are out there. We do still have to go out and do that market research, but we're not trying to create something new that would be an additional cost for companies. We're trying to ultimately save money for companies. We do need to figure out exactly how to price that and do all of those things, but the vision here is not that this will put undue strain on those companies and so they won't be able to afford it. It is to provide a solution that is more affordable for them. If we can't do that, then it's...
Sean, I think your audio froze. Sorry.
Just for the last second, Sean.
Yeah, for the last 1 second.
Yeah, great.
But we got your point. We did get your point, though. Yeah, you got it across. Thank you.
I think the key point here also, just to add to that, is there's synergistic value in all of this, right? An integrated system. There's potential. I know this phrase that I'm going to say has a little bit of variable expression or understanding. There's potential for cost sharing, but just like John said, and Patrick said, and Pedro has mentioned, and Chris has mentioned, this is intended to begin to streamline this entire process. The hope is, with that streamlined efficiency, the economy of scale that we will be developing, that this will get to a point where it starts to, in a sense, save money for the innovators to go through this. And very fundamentally, although we're focusing here on the innovator and the cost, since that's the question, fundamentally that entire system will hopefully decrease the hurdles, create an economy of scale, make it make sense for innovators to invest in the pediatric device market, innovate in the pediatric device market, sustain in the pediatric device market, and hopefully that market will grow. And fundamentally, there will be more devices that are designed, evaluated, and approved for children. Right? That's where we're really going to, and we want to support all the different stakeholders. And I believe Pedro has, commented on this a number of times before, that there are so many benefits to all stakeholders in terms of how we have envisioned the structure of ShipMD.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think we tend to focus on particular funding mechanisms like SBIR and so forth. I think this is much broader than that. SBIR are great, often for the early phases, really, more than, sort of preclinical. That's where they're really, most helpful. When you get to a clinical trial or even an early feasibility study, that's a lot harder to get. And you're going to go for investment funding. If an investor looks at this and says, well, if you can reduce the costs of conducting that clinical trial and by both the upfront expenses, but also the time that it takes you to do it, that's a huge value. It's a huge value for the investor. It's a huge value for the company. That's what we're talking about. And that is much, much bigger, actually, added value than even, I would argue, the early phase, the phase 1 grant or the phase 2 grant SBIR.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Pedro.
I think if I could add on to that, and it comes on, Kamaljeet, to another question that we received about, investors still may have a hard time with these small markets. And admittedly, yes, these will be small markets, and they will still be small sort of addressable markets, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly why these operational efficiencies and cost and time savings are so critical, and what the real value would be. And I think that's, that is exactly why we're here. And it's a good question. It's something that we've certainly examined and kept in the back of our mind as we've developed this framework.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, Russell.
Part of the reason why I think it's important for SHIP to be involved in the reimbursable side, because that, independent of the volume of the market, just the clarifying the reimbursal strategy as well as what will happen could be a lifesaver for an early stage company that's moving into the early commercialization. That's a critical time period, and if you cannot cross that hurdle because it takes so long to get a approval for reimbursal, that may be the end of the product. So SHIP is really aimed at the whole trajectory, the whole navigation, if you will. We've used the nautical terms a lot today and yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah, it really is that integrated system. And so I agree with Pedro's point, just to add a little bit more to Patrick's, just to help build some clarity around this, and this is more conceptual. But for, the person asked the question around, this perception that the markets are small. Yeah, there is likely validity to that, but we've got to be also understanding when we think about economies historically in terms of evolution, and we talk about building economies of scale, there is always and has always been the growth of those economies. These are, there has to be a catalyst to help begin that process. And perhaps our hope is that ShipMD will be part of that catalyst, I think as Chris and Patrick mentioned at the beginning of their talks as well.
Right. Thanks, Wessam. I remember the point that you brought and everyone else brought about the costs to the companies and how SHIP is intended to save costs. There was another external question, but I think it's really relevant and probably would be good for the audience to hear an answer. Will the participating hospitals, service providers, and strategics such as insurers pay a participation fee to the SHIP? So they also have the potential to benefit. Is there a fee there? What will the fee there look like? Any thoughts about it?
Yeah.
Yes, you go ahead.
I can kick it off while I was collecting thought. So as we talked about, I mentioned that phrase of cost sharing, right? Again, lots of different interpretations of what that means from an economic standpoint and a business modeling standpoint. But very simply, when you ask about the specific question of are hospitals going to be paying fees to this, I think we have to start thinking about fees more as collaborative investments, right? Because the efficiencies that the hospitals may provide to all of this is a great benefit in itself. And there's a potential, maybe with the cost sharing structure for the hospitals to have a model where maybe their costs are not going to be as high as if you tried to contract with them independently. So, and I don't want us to focus on that because we still need to think about what is the appropriate business model for it to make business sense for the hospitals as well. And that's going to be one of those topics that we want to address as we move along with the development process. But very simply put, I want people to think about this in a more integrated fashion. And I use that term synergistic value by leveraging the comparative advantage opportunities of the different stakeholders in this entire environment where everybody is getting some benefit. There is going to be hopefully an overall reduction in costs generally, a streamlined process, and again, fundamentally more devices being developed and it making sense for innovators to develop those devices from a business standpoint and fundamentally the public health good of having more devices designed, evaluated, and approved for children. Thanks,
Wessam. So this is just a time check. We have 10 minutes left into the session. I do have at least a few more questions for the panelists. There's been a particularly interesting question by Karen Feinberg. What about crowdfunding, social impact investing, or equity crowdfunding? I think sources such as crowdfunding would be a great vehicle for ShipMD. And then, Karen also continues that regarding crowdfunding or for initial phase of the funding, SHIP, and maybe, do you think experts of crowdfunding could be a part of SHIP expert network if, we are considering those type of sources for funding this initiative?
My view is that if SHIP is implemented the right way, we should try and open up as many doors to funding for innovators as possible. And that would be from philanthropists, that would be from impact-oriented venture philanthropists that may seek to get their money back but not an astronomical return. It should include some of these new pathways, like crowdfunding, that carry certain complexities and regulatory restrictions and other things with them that innovators would need to think about. And we also should think about the traditional venture capital and angel community. And so I think if we do this right, if we can prove that the economics of investing in pediatric devices are clear and can be compared favorably to other things in the system, and we can show the benefits of this, I think we will attract various forms of support. If the question was directed at whether crowdfunding will be appropriate for SHIP itself, I think that's more difficult. I would see potentially the need for intermediation and expertise insofar as patient groups or hospital endowments and others would have real kind of expertise and knowledge bases that make it effective to interact with this. Certain crowdfunding sites that I've seen don't necessarily come with that level of advice and expertise that I think we'd want to have at the table for SHIP as an entity. But that's my own personal opinion.
Thank you, Chris. There's another question regarding international participation in SHIP-MD from Imelda. Is there any plan to include international hospitals in the SHIP network? Vasum, I think I'm going to direct this question to you. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, Imelda, thanks for the question. I think it's an important one. Again, as all of these have been, I'm glad to really see the nuanced aspects of a lot of these questions. Very simply put, I think right now what we want to focus on is let's get this off the ground and make it work in the U.S. Is there a potential from a public good standpoint, especially for creating connections across the globe? Absolutely. Could that be a long-term vision for the SHIP system? Absolutely. There are current efforts going on with our IMDRF organization to be able to provide some level of quote-unquote harmonization, especially amongst regulatory bodies across the globe. And then just very simply from a pediatrics and small population standpoint, the more efficiently that we can, again, aggregate the populations and be able to generate the evidence in a safe environment, the better off we'll be for being more clear about clinical potential and improvement of outcomes for children in the long term. So I think the simple point is let's focus here on the U.S. and let's definitely keep in mind the potential for a more harmonized connection with perhaps those optimal pediatric academic medical centers across the globe as well.
Mm-hmm.
If I could follow up on that, because this also is relevant to the whole hospital discussion about the hub and spoke model. Many large pediatric hospitals in the U.S. have links with or have relationships with other hospitals outside the U.S. And I think that's potentially a mechanism, because if the goal is to generate data and to generate evidence, there's certainly a very good precedent for that for many of the regulatory data generation trials. And so I would think that may be a mechanism, but certainly at the start, I think even in a hub and spoke model, you want to get the hubs off the ground first, and then think in terms of what other connections might make sense, particularly for certain really truly rare diseases where it may actually be necessary to link with an outside institution.
Thank you, Pedro. I have a question that would be relevant for our AdvaMed colleagues, Tara Federici and Patrick. Will SHIP-MD create areas of focus to encourage several entrepreneurs to focus on the greatest need? And also, will the consortium expand into areas such as digital health, therapeutics, preventive care, and immunization? Tara, do you have any? I should start with you.
That's going to depend. I think it's a great question, one, but a lot of it's going to depend on how quickly we can stand up the concept of SHIP-MD and the types of applications that come in. Obviously, as we've just been talking about, we first have to get our hubs up and running, and there'll be a certain amount of expertise that those hubs have. and we'll have to match that with the types of applications that are coming in and decide whether or not ShipMD has the right expertise. And again, over time, as Pedro has indicated, we should be able to expand through the spokes into providing a broad-based depth of expertise for all types of applications. And Patrick, I'd appreciate your thoughts as well, or anyone else on the panel.
It could be expansive, but again, focused on medical devices, and that is, it's a broad sector, if you will. But that would be the focus. To certainly see digital health products and some of those therapeutic devices being part of this, but moving into drugs or other therapeutics, I think, would not be the objective here.
Yeah. And if I can kind of
thanks for making that clarification, Patrick.
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that as well. I think that's an important point, Patrick. I appreciate it. I agree with what Tara mentioned as well. And I do want to make sure that people recognize that, things like digital health, those aren't distinct from medical devices, right? That's part of the fundamentals of medical devices. And I also want to help us begin to perhaps just shift thinking a little bit also around, we always talk about the areas of need, and certainly there are areas that may be more needful than others, especially in pediatric device development. But we want to create a system or a platform with ShipMD that allows any great idea that's ready to benefit from ShipMD to get through the process and be able to make a difference for children. That's the intent here. So, our intent isn't to specifically focus on one area or another, but be able to create a system that works for all great innovation, all great technology, all great medical devices that can make a difference for children. Right? That's where we want to head.
Thank you, Vasam. I apologize. I'm going to run over the time allotted this because I think I do have two more questions that I would really like answered, and they're really interesting questions that I do feel audience deserves to hear the answers. First one is, has SHIP surveyed, just wanted to check with the panelists. Are you guys okay with staying a few more extra minutes, right? Okay. So has SHIP surveyed innovators to see what services they want and what would they pay for it? Or will we survey the innovators in the future if we haven't done that yet?
We have not done that. We did preliminary market research, pulling on some databases and publicly available resources to understand sort of the number of companies that may be out there that would avail themselves of ShipMD services, but we have not examined what their specific interests and appetite would be. But that would be something that would be highly recommended and necessary in that strategic planning phase.
Thanks, Patrick. Yes, hi, Representative. Go ahead. I think you're on mute.
Yep. Yeah. So, Vasum, maybe a related question is, the whole SHIP concept for the last several days as we've been talking about it, there are elements of the construct that are tangible, some that are less tangible, and as we're moving forward to try and kind of nail down in more concrete terms the boundaries of SHIP, are there aspects of what has been heard so far, and maybe the last question was trying to get at this, but are there aspects of what's been discussed so far that seem like more of a slam dunk around the financing piece, or are there some that seem like more of a reach? I think there is opportunity for the discussion about finance to maybe inform some of the other sessions and work streams that have been discussed for the last few days. I'm curious about people's reflections on this point.
Other panelists?
I could just jump in and say that, I haven't been able to participate in all of the panels, obviously, because some are running simultaneously, but we've gotten fabulous questions, and embedded in many of those questions are concepts. And I think the next stage is for us to go through many of those questions and the concepts embedded within them to help inform the next stage. And again, that was the intent of the public meeting. But I think through the questions we've gotten, there have been some great suggestions that can inform each work stream, including finance.
Onto that and say, I think the structure of this workshop was such that we got really granular detail on specific topics, whether that's reimbursement or regulations or finance. And I think as we digest and try to integrate that information, some concepts will become quite clear about what is the most rational approach to take. Reimbursement and finance being sort of a natural two to come together into a conceptual phase. So I think it's been a wonderful workshop from that vantage point.
I agree with both of those points, and the question was not the question was asking to see whether there were any insights that would sort of lead us into the next discussion. Yeah, I understand that. That the purpose of this workshop is to kind of lay out broadly all the different elements on the table, and that there is a plan, obviously, to look for integration in the next step. I'm hoping for a sneak preview, some reflections from the crowd before we get to that next step.
Well, Jim, I'll chime in. I feel like we've, in the financial operating models that we've proposed here and laid out, that having that foundation of a mix of public and private grants to underpin certainly that, the consortium as it started, and then ShipMD as that freestanding entity. I feel like, I don't know if it's a slam dunk, but I feel like we're on the right path there. I think there certainly are some questions to be answered around the fee-for-service model, and some of that is just a bit of chicken and egg. Like, we need to define the services and then, be able to reflect on the addressable market, if you will, the number of innovators that are out there, their, price sensitivity, their interest in these services. So I think there's some definite room for exploration and further understanding there. But again, I feel like we're on the right path. It's come up a few times what the responsibility or the payment from hospitals or payers would be. And I think we've talked about that, again, going back to the system-wide sort of network effects of this and the benefits that would be provided, and the maybe not explicit but implicit cost sharing that goes on as those groups would participate in this entity. I think that's an area where we need to explore again a little further, and there's been some questions that are still there for us to address.
I've got a really, if you can hear me here, I've got a really simple sneak peek, and I think that this workshop has absolutely validated that there is a value proposition out there. We've got a huge number of people participate. We've gotten some really insightful questions and feedback. And I think what this does is it lays the groundwork to go out and start to try to put together and find the funding, philanthropic, grant, money probably, but to put that value proposition on the table and get some money to take this to the next step to answer many of these important questions. And we need to raise some capital to get people to do this full time, to be invested in it. But right now we're starting to get the pieces that can make that, bring that narrative together. So I'm really optimistic coming out of this that there's some meat in the bones there.
All are, absolutely. Very optimistic. This has been an excellent discussion, and really great back and forth. And I, more than anyone else, I would like to thank the audience for sticking with us for 3 days, asking such great questions, across the fields, and I do see some familiar faces asking questions on the third consecutive day. So thank you so very much again from the bottom of my heart for staying with us, for asking great questions and being here. And this meeting is not yet over. There is another breakout session that is going to start soon, and then after that there's going to be a really interesting closing session. So please join back in. And thank you so much to the participants and the presenters for your great contributions. And I do look forward to being with you again very, very soon.